When Ethan Cole tucks his 8-year-old twins into bed each night, he whispers the same prayer his late wife once did. The widowed handyman never expected that fixing a storm-damaged roof would lead to the answer he'd been seeking. Celeste Harrington, a lonely billionaire widow, watched this gentleman work through the night to save her home from the next storm. When he refused extra payment, saying his kids needed dry beds more than he needed bonuses, something stirred in her heart. In her empty mansion, she saw what they both needed: a real family. She had orphaned niece and nephew who needed a father figure. He had twins who needed stability. But when she asked him to become more than just her handyman, would this grieving father risk everything for a second chance at love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered red toolbox sat on Ethan Cole's kitchen counter like a faithful companion, its dented surface bearing witness to 3 generations of honest work. His grandfather had carried it through the Great Depression, his father through the post-war boom. And now Ethan hefted its familiar weight each morning before heading out to fix whatever needed fixing in the small coastal village of Millbrook Bay. "Dad, you forgot to put jam on my toast," Maddie announced from the breakfast table, her auburn pigtails catching the morning light that streamed through their modest cottage's east-facing window. At 8 years old, she possessed her mother's keen eye for detail and her father's gentle persistence. "Mine too," Max chimed in, though he was more focused on arranging his scrambled eggs into perfect lines across his plate. Where Maddie was all energy and observation, Max moved through the world with careful deliberation, every action measured and thoughtful. Ethan smiled as he retrieved the strawberry jam from the refrigerator, Sarah's homemade preserves from the summer before she passed. Even 2 years later, he couldn't bring himself to finish the last jar, rationing it like liquid gold. "Can't have dry toast on a Tuesday," he said, spreading just enough to make the children happy while preserving what remained. The kitchen held Sarah's presence in a dozen small ways. The herb garden she'd planted outside the window, still thriving under Ethan's careful tending. Her recipe cards tucked into the corner of the mirror above the sink, the way she'd arranged the blue and white dishes in the cabinet. Sometimes Ethan caught himself setting 4 places at the table before remembering there were only 3 of them now. "Mrs. Henderson said there's a big storm coming," Maddie reported between bites of toast. "She said it might be the biggest one since Hurricane Elena." Ethan glanced toward the window where the morning sky showed the first hints of grey on the horizon. The weatherman had been tracking the system for days, a late-season nor'easter that promised to test every roof, window, and foundation along the Maine coast. For a handyman whose business depended on emergency repairs, storms were both blessing and curse. They brought work, but they also brought worry about his own small home and the children who depended on him. "We'll be fine," he assured them, the same words Sarah used to say when storms approached. "Our house has weathered worse than whatever's coming." Max looked up from his geometric egg arrangement. "Will you have to work in the rain again?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Last month, Ethan had been called out during a thunderstorm to fix a fallen tree that had punched through the Morettis' roof. He'd come home soaked and shivering, and both children had worried themselves sick until he walked through the door. Being a single parent meant every risk felt magnified, every decision weighted with consequences beyond himself. "Only if someone really needs help," Ethan said, which was his way of saying yes without making promises he might not be able to keep. In a town like Millbrook Bay, where most residents were either elderly retirees or young families barely making ends meet, emergency repairs often meant the difference between a home and a disaster. After breakfast, Ethan loaded the twins into his battered pickup truck for the daily school run. The vehicle had seen better years, but its engine ran true, and its bed could carry everything from lumber to lawnmowers. Sarah used to joke that the truck was more reliable than the weather forecast, and she hadn't been wrong. Millbrook Bay stretched out before them as they drove down Harbour Street, a picture postcard New England village that looked like it had been plucked from a tourism brochure. White shingled cottages lined the narrow streets, their window boxes still bright with late-season chrysanthemums. The harbour held perhaps 24 boats, mostly lobster vessels, and a few pleasure craft that would be hauled and stored before the winter storms arrived in earnest. "There's the castle," Max said, pointing toward the massive stone structure that dominated the headland above the village. Even from a mile away, the Harrington mansion commanded attention, a Gothic revival masterpiece built by a railroad baron in the 1880s, and now home to the most mysterious resident in Millbrook Bay. Celeste Harrington had lived there for nearly a decade, ever since her husband's death, but she might as well have been a ghost for all the interaction she had with the village below. Groceries appeared at her gate as if by magic, delivered by a service from Portland. Mail arrived through the same mysterious channels. The grounds were maintained by a crew that drove up from Freeport twice a month, and if she needed anything else, it was handled by people who didn't live in Millbrook Bay and didn't talk to those who did. "Why do you think she stays up there all alone?" Maddie asked, pressing her face to the truck's window for a better view. Ethan had wondered the same thing countless times. Local gossip painted Celeste Harrington as everything from an eccentric recluse to a grieving widow who simply couldn't face the world. The truth was probably simpler and sadder than either extreme. She was a woman who had lost her anchor and hadn't figured out how to set sail again. "Sometimes people need time to heal," Ethan said, the words carrying his own understanding of grief's strange geography. "Big houses can feel safe when the world feels too big." The elementary school sat at the heart of the village, a brick building that had educated 3 generations of Millbrook Bay children. Ethan walked Max and Maddie to their classroom doors, receiving hugs that would sustain him through whatever the day might bring. Teaching assistant Mrs. Chen waved from the hallway, and Principal Rodriguez gave him a friendly nod, small gestures that reminded Ethan how the community had embraced him and the children after Sarah's death. "Pick you up at 3:15, he called after the twins, the same ritual they performed every morning. Routine was the scaffolding that held their small family together, predictable moments that created security in an uncertain world. Back in the truck, Ethan consulted his work schedule for the day. Mrs. Patterson needed her front steps repaired before the storm arrived. The Kowalskis had a gutter that had been pulling away from their house for 2 weeks. The Millbrook Bay Community Center had asked him to look at their heating system before the weather turned cold. Honest work that paid honest wages, though never quite enough to build the kind of cushion that would let him sleep easily at night. His phone rang as he pulled into the Patterson driveway, a number he didn't recognize with a Portland area code. "Cole Handyman Services," he answered, his standard greeting that made his one-man operation sound more substantial than it was. "Mr. Cole, this is Janet Morrison, estate manager for Mrs. Harrington, up on Cliff Point. We have an emergency situation and need someone immediately." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. In 10 years of business, he'd never received a call from the mansion on the hill. The Harrington estate was the kind of place that had its own maintenance staff, its own contractors, its own world that rarely intersected with the village below. "What kind of emergency?" he asked. "The storm last night damaged our roof extensively. We have active leaks in 3 areas, and the weather service is predicting another front moving through tonight. Mrs. Harrington is quite concerned about structural damage if we don't address this immediately." Ethan looked up at the mansion brooding on its cliff, barely visible through the morning haze. The practical part of his mind calculated the potential earnings from such a job emergency, repairs for wealthy clients paid well. And the Harrington estate represented the kind of financial windfall that could cover his mortgage payments for months. The cautious part wondered why they were calling him instead of some high-end Portland contractor. "I can be there within the hour," he heard himself saying, "but I should warn you, Mrs. Morrison, I'm a small operation. If you need a full roofing crew." Mrs. Harrington specifically requested a local contractor. Janet Morrison interrupted. She said she wanted someone who understands these coastal storms and can work quickly. "Your reputation in the village is excellent." After hanging up, Ethan sat in his truck for a long moment, studying the mansion that had loomed over his childhood like a benevolent giant. Every local kid had wondered what lay behind those stone walls, what kind of life the wealthy lived in their castle above the sea. Now he was about to find out. He drove home to load his truck with emergency repair supplier stops, roofing cement, spare shingles, and the array of tools that could patch almost any problem until proper repairs could be made. The red toolbox rode in the passenger seat like a talisman, carrying the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of men who had made their living with their hands. The road to Cliff Point wound through scrub pines and granite outcroppings, climbing steadily until Millbrook Bay spread out below like a child's toy village. The mansion revealed itself gradually, first the slate roof with its complex array of chimneys and dormers, then the Gothic windows that seemed to watch the approach of visitors. Finally, the massive stone facade that had weathered more than a century of Maine winters. Up close, the damage was immediately apparent. The nor'easter had torn perhaps 24 slate tiles from the main roof, leaving raw patches of underlayment exposed to the elements. Water stains around the damaged areas suggested the leaks had already begun, and with another storm system approaching, the situation would only worsen. Janet Morrison met him at the service entrance, a brisk woman in her 60s who carried herself with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing large households. She led him through service corridors that reminded Ethan of something from a historical movie, all polished wood and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. "The main damage is in the east wing," she explained as they climbed a narrow servants' stairway. "We've placed buckets to catch the drips, but Mrs. Harrington is quite concerned about her late husband's library. Many of the books are irreplaceable." They emerged into a hallway lined with portraits and lit by crystal chandeliers, the kind of space that spoke of old money and older traditions. Through an open doorway, Ethan caught his first glimpse of Celeste Harrington herself, a slender woman in her early 50s, standing in what appeared to be a library, staring up at water stains that spread across an ornate plaster ceiling like dark flowers. She turned as they approached, and Ethan found himself looking into eyes that held the same quiet grief he recognized in his own mirror. Celeste Harrington was beautiful in the way that some women become more attractive with age and experience. Her silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, her clothes expensive but understated. But it was the sadness that drew his attention, a profound weariness that spoke of losses that couldn't be repaired with tools and determination. "Mrs. Harrington, this is Ethan Cole, the contractor I mentioned," Janet said. "Mr. Cole." Her voice carried the cultured tones of someone educated at the finest schools, but also a warmth that surprised him. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm afraid we have quite a mess on our hands." Ethan examined the water damage, tracing the stains to their source and calculating the work needed to prevent further destruction. "The good news is that it's mostly cosmetic at this point," he said. "The bad news is that if we don't get those roof leaks sealed before tonight's storm, you could be looking at serious structural damage. Can you fix it?" The question carried more weight than it should have, as if the answer mattered beyond the immediate crisis. "I can patch it well enough to get you through the storm," Ethan said. "But for permanent repairs, you'll want to bring in a proper roofing crew when the weather clears." Celeste nodded, but he caught something in her expression relief that seemed disproportionate to the situation. It was then that Ethan realized this wasn't just about roof repairs. For a woman who had lived alone in this vast house for nearly a decade, any crisis must feel overwhelming. Any stranger entering her carefully controlled world must represent both threat and possibility. "Whatever you need to do, Mr. Cole, Janet will provide whatever supplies or assistance you require." As she spoke, Ethan noticed a framed photograph on the library desk, younger Celeste laughing beside a tall man with kind eyes, both of them surrounded by what appeared to be extended family at some celebration. The contrast between that joyful woman and the solitary figure before him told a story of loss that needed no words. The storm clouds were building on the horizon as Ethan carried his tools up to the roof, the wind already beginning to gust with the promise of worse weather to come. From 3 stories above the village, Millbrook Bay looked like a maritime painting white cottages clustered around the harbour, lobster boats bobbing at their moorings, the sea beyond already showing whitecaps that spoke of the storm's approach. He had perhaps 6 hours to make the mansion weatherproof, 6 hours to patch the wounds that nature had torn in this woman's sanctuary. As he began the careful work of sealing the damaged areas, Ethan found himself thinking about the photograph in the library, about the way grief could freeze a life in amber, about how sometimes the most important repairs weren't the ones you could see. The first drops of rain began to fall as he secured the last of the emergency patches, fat droplets that promised a long night ahead. But the roof would hold, the library would stay dry, and somewhere in the vast house below, a lonely woman would sleep secure in the knowledge that her walls would weather another storm. Ethan Cole had spent his adult life fixing things that were broken. He had never imagined that sometimes the most important repair work happened not with tools and materials, but with presence and understanding, with the simple act of showing up when someone needed help. The storm was coming, but for the first time in months, he felt ready for whatever it might bring. The small leather notebook that lived in Ethan's shirt pocket had recorded every emergency call for the past 5 years, water heater failures at 3 in the morning, fallen trees blocking driveways, burst pipes that couldn't wait for regular business hours. Each entry told a story of someone's crisis moment, but the notation he made on October 15th would prove different from all the others. Harrington Estate, emergency roof repair, storm approaching. By 5 o'clock, the wind had picked up to a steady howl that rattled the mansion's diamond-paned windows and sent autumn leaves spiraling across the grounds like golden snow. Ethan worked methodically across the damaged section of roof, each repair calculated to withstand the punishment that Maine weather could deliver. The slate tiles were a century old, crafted by artisans who understood that buildings in this climate needed to be as sturdy as the granite cliffs they perched upon. "Mr. Cole?" Celeste's voice carried up from the library window below, concern evident even through the wind. "Should you be up there in this weather?" He paused in his work, looking down at her upturned face framed by the Gothic arch of the window. Even from 3 stories up, he could see the worry in her expression, not the irritation of an impatient client, but genuine concern for his safety. When had anyone besides his children worried about him that way? "I'm fine, Mrs. Harrington," he called back. "Just want to get this section sealed before the real weather hits." The truth was more complicated. Ethan had worked in worse conditions, but something about this particular job felt different. Maybe it was the way Celeste had looked at the water damage in her husband's library, as if each stain represented another piece of her carefully preserved world cracking apart. Maybe it was the recognition he'd seen in her eyes, the look of someone who understood what it meant to hold things together through sheer force of will. As darkness fell, Janet Morrison appeared with a thermos of coffee and a worried expression. "Mrs. Harrington insists you come inside," she said. "The weather service has upgraded their warning. This storm is going to be worse than predicted." Ethan accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands stiff from the cold and the repetitive motion of securing patches. The hot liquid carried hints of cinnamon and vanilla expensive coffee, nothing like the generic brand he bought in bulk at the grocery store. "How much worse?" "Sustained winds up to 70 miles per hour, with gusts potentially reaching hurricane force. They're calling it a once-in-a-decade storm." Through the library window, Ethan could see Celeste pacing near the bookshelves, her silhouette moving restlessly against the warm glow of table lamps. The sight stirred something protective in him, the same instinct that made him check on Max and Maddie multiple times during storms, the need to ensure that those under his care were safe and secure. "I need another 2 hours," he said. 3 at most. This roof has to be sealed or she'll have water cascading through that library like Niagara Falls. Janet nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "She's quite grateful, you know. It's been years since anyone worked this hard for her." The comment stayed with Ethan as he returned to the roof, his headlamp cutting through the increasing darkness. Years since anyone worked hard for her. What kind of isolation did that suggest? He thought of his own support network in the village, the way neighbors checked on him and the children, the informal community that made single parenthood possible. Celeste Harrington might live in a mansion worth millions, but she seemed poorer than he was in the ways that truly mattered. The storm struck with the fury that only coastal New England could deliver. Rain came in, sheets that turned horizontal in the wind, each drop feeling like a small stone against exposed skin. Ethan's world narrowed to the immediate task: seal this gap, secure that flashing, check every potential point of failure before nature could exploit it. His headlamp created a small circle of light in an ocean of darkness, and beyond that circle lay nothing but wind and rain, and the growing certainty that this storm would test every repair he'd made. Somewhere around midnight, exhaustion began to claw at the edges of his concentration. The coffee was long gone, his clothes were soaked despite his rain gear, and his hands trembled slightly as he made the final adjustments to the emergency patches, but the work was holding. Each section he'd repaired remained tight and dry, shedding water exactly as it should. As he packed his tools, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen, the teaching assistant who lived next door to his cottage. "Kids are fine, both asleep, house secure, stay safe." The message reminded him that his own small world was weathering the storm, that Max and Maddie were tucked safely in their beds while he worked to protect someone else's sanctuary. The parallel wasn't lost on him: two single parents, two households trying to maintain stability in the face of forces beyond their control. When he finally climbed down from the roof, Celeste was waiting in the service entrance with towels and another thermos of coffee. Her hair had escaped its careful arrangement, giving her a more approachable appearance, and she wore a thick cardigan that made her look less like a wealthy recluse and more like someone's worried aunt. "You're soaked through," she said, handing him the towels. "Janet prepared the guest room if you'd prefer not to drive in this weather." Ethan considered the offer as he dried his face and hands. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the winding road down to the village would be treacherous in these conditions. But staying meant crossing some invisible line, stepping from the role of hired contractor into something more personal. "The repairs will hold," he said instead, "but I should check them once more when the wind dies down." "Then you'll stay?" It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. Something in between that suggested she needed the reassurance of his presence as much as his professional expertise. They sat in the mansion's kitchen while the storm raged outside, drinking coffee and listening to the wind test every joint and joist in the century-old structure. The kitchen was surprisingly modest for such a grand house, clearly designed for function rather than display, with worn wooden counters and copper pots that showed the patina of actual use. "My husband used to love storms like this," Celeste said, staring into her coffee cup. "He'd stand at the windows and watch the waves crash against the rocks. Said it reminded him that some forces in the world couldn't be bought or controlled." It was the first personal detail she'd shared, and Ethan sensed the weight of memory behind the words. "How long has he been gone?" 9 years this December. Heart attack at 57, completely unexpected. One morning he was planning a business trip to Tokyo. That afternoon he was gone. The arbitrary cruelty of it resonated with Ethan's own experience. Sarah's cancer had given them time to prepare, time to say goodbye, but perhaps sudden loss carried its own burdens, the weight of things left unsaid, plans that would never come to fruition. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "People always say that time heals, but I think they're wrong. Time just teaches you to carry the weight differently." Outside, something large crashed against the side of the house, probably a tree branch torn loose by the wind. Celeste flinched at the sound, her careful composure cracking slightly to reveal the vulnerability beneath. "The house will be fine," Ethan assured her. "These old places were built to last. Your great-grandfather's architects knew what they were doing." Great-grandfather, actually. Railroad money from the 1880s. He built this place as a summer cottage. She managed a small smile at the absurdity. 15 bedrooms for a summer cottage. "And now it's just you?" The question hung in the air between them. too personal for the professional relationship they were supposed to maintain, but somehow natural in the intimate setting of the storm-bound kitchen. "Just me," she confirmed, "though I have 2 children, me late brothers twins. They're at boarding school in Massachusetts." It seemed. She paused, searching for words. It seemed like the right choice at the time. Ethan thought of Max and Maddie asleep in their own beds, safe and secure in the knowledge that he would be there when they woke up. The idea of sending them away to school, no matter how excellent the education felt like, tearing out pieces of his own heart. "How old are they?" 12 and 10, Emma and James. "They've been with me since their parents died in that plane crash 3 years ago." Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to discuss tragedy without breaking apart. The wind howled with renewed fury, and Ethan felt the storm settling in for a long siege. But inside the mansion's solid walls, with coffee warming his hands and the satisfaction of work well done settling over him like a comfortable blanket, he found himself thinking that some emergency calls led to exactly where you needed to be. Dawn would bring damage assessment and the careful work of permanent repairs. But for now, there was only the storm outside, and the growing realization that sometimes the most important fixes couldn't be accomplished with tools and materials. Sometimes they required nothing more complicated than 2 lonely people discovering they weren't as alone as they'd thought. Around Ethan's neck, hidden beneath his work shirt, hung a thin gold chain that held his most precious possessions, Sarah's wedding ring. He'd stopped wearing his own ring 2 years ago, when the children had finally stopped asking when Mommy was coming home, but hers remained close to his heart. A tangible reminder of promises kept and love that death couldn't diminish. As he worked through the night on Celeste's roof, the ring pressed against his chest with each movement, a gentle weight that both comforted and questioned. The storm had settled into a rhythm by 2 in the morning periods of intense fury, followed by brief lulls that felt like the house itself was catching its breath. During one such pause, Ethan heard the soft scrape of a window opening below and looked down to see Celeste leaning out from the library, her face pale in the reflected light from his headlamp. "You should come down," she called up to him. "This is beyond what anyone should be expected to do." "Almost finished," he replied, though they both knew he could have stopped hours ago. The emergency patches were holding perfectly, the immediate crisis had passed, but something kept him working, perhaps the knowledge that once he climbed down from this roof, the spell would be broken, and they would return to being strangers separated by the vast gulf between the mansion on the hill and the cottage in the village. "The coffee's still hot," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she needed his company as much as he needed to finish the work properly. A memory surfaced, unbidden Sarah standing in their doorway during the ice storm of 2019, worry etched across her features as she watched him secure tarps over their neighbor's damaged roof. "Ethan Cole," she'd said, "you'd work yourself to death helping other people if I didn't drag you inside occasionally." The echo of her words in Celeste's concern created an unexpected bridge across time and circumstance. 5 more minutes, he promised, and meant it this time. The final shingle went into place with the satisfying click of a job done right. Ethan ran his hands along each repair one last time, checking for any weakness that the wind might exploit, then gathered his tools and began the careful descent. His body ached in places he'd forgotten existed, and his hands were so cold they barely responded to his commands, but the roof would hold. Whatever the storm could throw at it for the rest of the night, Celeste's sanctuary would remain dry. She met him at the service door with a look of relief that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "I kept thinking you were going to blow right off the roof," she said, handing him a thick towel. "The wind was so fierce I could feel the house shaking. These old places are tougher than they look," Ethan said, though he'd noticed the tremor in the walls himself. "Your great-great-grandfather built this house to last centuries, not decades." Back in the kitchen, they resumed their positions at the worn wooden table, the intimacy of the storm-bound night making formal conversation impossible. Celeste poured fresh coffee from a pot that had clearly been kept warm for his return, and Ethan found himself studying her face in the soft light, the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, the way her hands moved with unconscious grace even in this simple domestic task. "Tell me about your children," she said, settling back into her chair. "The twins you mentioned." The question unlocked something in Ethan's chest, the same feeling he got when someone asked to see pictures of Max and Maddie. There ain't Max and Maddie. Completely different personalities, but they balance each other out. Max is the planner, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Maddie's the explorer, ready to climb any tree or investigate any mystery. They sound wonderful and challenging. Every day, he smiled at memories that played like movies in his mind. Last week, Maddie decided she was going to build a fort in the backyard. Not just any fort, this was going to have multiple rooms, a drawbridge, and a periscope for watching the harbor. Max spent 2 hours drawing blueprints while she gathered every piece of scrap wood in the neighborhood. Did they succeed? Well, it looked more like abstract art than architecture, but they were so proud of it that I didn't have the heart to suggest improvements. Sometimes the process matters more than the result. Celeste nodded, but something in her expression shifted a shadow that spoke of different experiences with children, different choices made for different reasons. "Emma and James are at Phillips Academy," she said. "Excellent academics, wonderful opportunities. They come home for holidays and summer break." The careful way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him, made Ethan wonder what kind of holidays they were. He thought of Christmas morning in his cottage, Max and Maddie tearing through wrapping paper while pancakes burned on the stove because he was too busy watching their faces to tend the griddle properly. Messy, chaotic, perfect. "That must be hard," he said carefully, "being apart so much." It seemed like the best choice after their parents died. Stability, routine, the kind of education that would prepare them for. She trailed off, perhaps realizing how hollow the justification sounded spoken aloud in this kitchen where the storm had stripped away pretense. For what? For a world that won't be gentle with them. For independence. For not needing to depend on anyone who might. Again she stopped herself. But this time, Ethan understood the unfinished thought. Who might leave them? The recognition in her eyes confirmed his guess. Here was the real wound, not just her husband's death, but the terror of becoming attached to children who had already lost so much. The fear of being another adult who might disappoint or abandon them. "It's different when they're your own," Ethan said gently. "When Sarah was sick, people kept telling me I should prepare the children for the worst, help them understand that sometimes people we love have to go away. But I realized that wasn't my job. My job was to love them completely for however long I had the chance. And after she died, my job became loving them enough for both of us." The simple statement hung between them, carrying weight that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Celeste stared into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't known she was asking. "I keep their rooms exactly as they left them," she said finally. "Emma's riding ribbons are still pinned to her bulletin board. James's model airplanes hang from the ceiling exactly where he positioned them. Sometimes I stand in their doorways and imagine what it would be like if they were really home or not, just visiting, but home. What would it be like? Loud," she said with a laugh that held more sadness than humor. "Messy, complicated, everything this house isn't." Outside, the wind was beginning to ease, the storm's fury spent after hours of battering the coast. But inside the kitchen, something else was gathering, strength, a connection forged in shared confidences, and the recognition that loneliness came in many forms, some of which money couldn't cure. "The repairs will hold," Ethan said eventually, though he made no move to leave. "But you'll want to have the slate replaced properly when the weather clears. I can recommend some good roofers from Portland." "What if I wanted you to do the work?" The question surprised him. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm flattered, but a roof that size, with materials that expensive you, needs specialists who work with historic properties. What if I don't care about the expense? What if I care about having someone I trust?" Trust. The word settled between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Ethan felt Sarah's ring warm against his chest, as if even in death she was nudging him toward possibilities he couldn't see clearly yet. Dawn was still hours away, but already something fundamental had shifted in the space between the mansion on the hill and the cottage in the village below. The door to David Harrington's home office remained exactly as he had left it on the morning of his death. Mahogany desk, arranged with mathematical precision, fountain pen positioned at the precise angle he preferred, even his coffee cup sitting in the same ring-stained spot on the leather desk pad. Celeste had instructed the housekeeping staff to dust around the objects but never to move them, creating a shrine to a life interrupted that she visited daily but could never quite bring herself to disturb. When Ethan arrived at the mansion the next morning with Max and Maddie in tow, breakfast had seemed like the natural conclusion to an extraordinary night. The children pressed their faces to the truck's windows as they wound up the cliff road, their eyes wide with the wonder that only 8-year-olds could muster when confronted with a real-life castle. "Is this where the princess lives?" Maddie asked, her breath fogging the glass. "She's not a princess, Maddie," Max corrected with the patient superiority of someone who was older by exactly 11 minutes. "She's a regular person who happens to live in a big house." "But look at those windows," Maddie persisted. "And those towers. If I lived here, I'd definitely be a princess." Ethan smiled at their chatter, but underneath the amusement lay a current of nervousness he couldn't quite name. Bringing his children into Celeste's carefully controlled world felt like introducing chaos into a museum, and he found himself issuing gentle warnings about touching things and using inside voices even before they reached the front door. Janet Morrison greeted them at the main entrance note, the service door Ethan had used during the emergency, but the grand foyer with its soaring ceiling and crystal chandelier that cast rainbow patterns across marble floors. The children fell silent, overawed by the sheer scale of the space, and Ethan felt a pang of something that might have been embarrassment at the contrast between their modest cottage and this palace on the cliff. "Mrs. Harrington is waiting in the breakfast room," Janet said, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she took in Max and Maddie's wonder-struck faces. "She's very much looking forward to meeting you both." The breakfast room was mercifully smaller than the foyer, though still grand by any reasonable standard. French doors opened onto a terrace that overlooked the village and harbour below, and the morning light streaming through tall windows made everything glow with golden warmth. Celeste stood when they entered, and Ethan noticed that she had changed from the previous night's casual clothes into something more formal, a navy dress that spoke of money and good taste, but also created distance. "You must be Max and Maddie," she said, her voice carrying the careful friendliness of someone who knew she was being evaluated. "I'm Celeste. Thank you for sharing your father with me during the storm." Max stepped forward first, extending his hand with the grave formality that made adults smile, and Ethan's heart swell with pride. "Thank you for having us, Mrs. Harrington. Dad says you have a really old house." "Very old," Celeste confirmed, shaking his small hand seriously. "It was built in 1887. That's older than your great-great-grandparents would have been." Maddie, never to be outdone, bounced forward on her toes. "Can we see the princess room?" "The princess room?" Celeste looked puzzled. "She means the tower rooms," Ethan explained. "Maddie's convinced that any house with towers must have princess rooms." "Well, there are quite a few rooms that might qualify," Celeste said, and for the first time since they'd arrived, her smile reached her eyes. "Perhaps after breakfast we could explore a bit." The meal was an exercise in careful navigation. Janet had prepared a spread that would have fed a small army fresh fruit, pastries, eggs prepared 3 different ways, bacon that was clearly not the grocery store variety Ethan bought in bulk. The children ate with the concentrated focus of people encountering luxury for the first time, while Ethan found himself watching Celeste watch them, cataloguing her reactions to the cheerful chaos that followed his children everywhere. "Dad, can we live here?" Maddie asked around a mouthful of croissant that was probably worth more than Ethan's grocery budget for a week. "Maddie," Ethan warned, but Celeste laughed, the first genuinely spontaneous sound he'd heard from her. "It is a very big house for just one person," she admitted. "Sometimes I think it gets lonely." "Houses can't get lonely," Max said with 8-year-old logic. "They're not alive." "No," Celeste agreed, "but the people in them can. And when there's only one person in a house with 15 bedrooms, it can feel quite empty." After breakfast, she led them on a tour that revealed the mansion's layers of history and personality. The formal room's drawing room, dining room, ballroom felt like museum pieces, beautiful but untouchable. But as they climbed to the upper floors, the spaces became more human. Guest bedrooms held evidence of visitors from decades past. A music room contained a grand piano that Celeste admitted she hadn't played since David's death. And then there was David's office. Celeste paused at the closed door, her hand resting on the brass knob without turning it. "This was my husband's study," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "He spent most of his time here when we were in residence." "Can we see it?" Maddie asked, with the innocent directness that made adults uncomfortable. "I don't think," Ethan began, but Celeste was already opening the door. The room smelled of leather and old tobacco, a masculine space dominated by dark wood and heavy furniture. But what struck Ethan immediately was how perfectly preserved it was, like a historical exhibit designed to show how a wealthy man of the early 21st century had lived and worked. "Wow," Max breathed, drawn to the massive desk with its array of antique accessories. "He must have been really important." "He was," Celeste said simply. "He built companies, created jobs for thousands of people. He changed the world in small ways every day." "Why don't you use his office now?" Maddie asked, running her finger along the edge of a bookshelf. "If he was my daddy and he went to heaven, I'd want to sit at his desk and remember him." The question hit Celeste like a physical blow. Ethan saw her composure crack, saw the careful control she maintained falter in the face of a child's clear-eyed wisdom. She began, then stopped, looking around the room as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "I suppose I thought that changing anything would mean forgetting him." "But you could remember him and still use the room," Max said, with the practical logic that made him such an effective problem solver. "Dad kept some of Mommy's things, but he put them where we could see them every day. That way we remember her, but we're not afraid to live in our house." Ethan felt his throat tighten at his son's words. When had Max become so wise about grief and memory? When had both his children learned to navigate loss with such grace? Celeste walked to the desk and picked up the fountain pen, holding it like a fragile bird. "He left for his office in Portland that morning, just like always. I was still in bed, barely awake. He kissed my forehead and said he'd see me at dinner." She set the pen down carefully, but not in its precise original position. "I've been waiting for him to come home for 9 years. "He did come home," Maddie said matter-of-factly. "He's in your heart. That's what Dad told us about Mommy." The simplicity of it, the child's ability to state profound truths without artifice, broke something open in the room. Celeste sank into David's leather chair, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, she looked like someone who might be ready to stop waiting and start living again. Outside the office windows, Millbrook Bay spread out in the distance like a promise of community and connection. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and bright with possibility. And in a room that had been a shrine to the past, 4 people began the delicate work of imagining what the future might hold. The dusty photo albums hidden in the library's lower shelves told the story of a different Celeste Harrington known, who laughed with abandon at family barbecues, who danced at wedding receptions, who looked genuinely happy, surrounded by the chaos of David's large extended family. These albums had remained untouched since his funeral, but on the first weekend that Ethan brought Max and Maddie to stay, Celeste found herself pulling them out, showing the children pictures of holidays and celebrations from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The weekend arrangement had evolved naturally from that first breakfast. Celeste had mentioned needing ongoing maintenance, work gutters to be cleaned, windows to be resealed, the kind of projects that required regular attention in a house of that size and age. Ethan had suggested weekend work to avoid disrupting the children's school schedule, and somehow they had settled into a pattern that felt both practical and precious. "Who are all these people?" Maddie asked, perched on the library sofa with a photo album spread across her lap. The image she was studying showed at least 30 people gathered around a Thanksgiving table, all of them laughing at something happening beyond the camera's frame. "David's family," Celeste said, settling beside her. "His parents, his 3 brothers, their wives and children. We used to host Thanksgiving here every year until he died," Max finished, matter-of-factly. At 8, he had learned that sometimes adults needed help completing difficult sentences. Yes, after that, everyone thought it would be too sad to continue the tradition here. "Were they right?" Maddie asked, studying Celeste's face with the intensity she usually reserved for examining interesting bugs or shiny rocks. Celeste considered the question seriously. "I thought they were. But looking at these pictures now, I think maybe we were all just scared. It's easier to avoid sadness than to figure out how to be sad and happy at the same time." Ethan looked up from the window casement he was resealing, struck by the wisdom in her words. He'd spent 2 years learning exactly that lesson, that joy and grief could coexist, that loving Max and Maddie completely didn't diminish his love for Sarah, that moving forward didn't mean leaving the past behind. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted their photo viewing, and Janet Morrison appeared in the library doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Harrington, Emma, and James are here. Their headmaster gave them permission to come home for the weekend as a surprise." The change in Celeste was immediate and profound. Color drained from her face, and she stood so quickly that the photo album slid to the floor, scattering pictures of happier times across the Persian rug. "They're here? But it's only October. They're not scheduled to come home until Thanksgiving." Apparently, Emma called the school and asked for a weekend pass, something about wanting to see the storm damage for themselves. Before anyone could respond, the sound of young voices echoed from the foyer, followed by footsteps on the marble stairs. Within moments, 2 children appeared in the library doorway, a girl of perhaps 12 with Celeste's auburn hair and intelligent eyes, and a boy a year or 2 younger who moved with the careful observation of someone accustomed to reading adult moods. "Aunt Celeste," Emma said, her voice carrying a careful neutrality that suggested she'd learned not to expect too much enthusiasm from homecomings. "We wanted to make sure you were okay after the storm." "Of course I'm okay," Celeste replied, but her body language was stiff, uncertain. "You should have called. I would have had Janet prepare your rooms properly." The formality in the exchange made Ethan's heart ache. He watched as Emma's eyes took in the scattered photographs, the cozy scene that had been interrupted by their arrival, the way Celeste seemed to shrink back into the controlled persona she'd worn like armor for so many years. "We didn't want to be any trouble," James said quietly, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd spent a lot of energy trying not to be trouble. Max and Maddie had gone silent, sensing the complex undercurrents in the room but not understanding them. Ethan made a decision that felt both presumptuous and necessary. "Emma James, I'm Ethan Cole," he said, crossing the room with his hand extended. "These are my children, Max and Maddie. We were just looking at some family pictures while I worked on the windows." Emma shook his hand with the grave courtesy of someone much older than 12. "You're the man who fixed the roof." "Your aunt is a very good storyteller," Ethan said. "She made it sound much more dramatic than it actually was." "She said you worked all night in the storm," James added, studying Ethan with curious eyes. "That's pretty dramatic." The conversation seemed to break some invisible spell. Celeste moved toward her niece and nephew, her posture relaxing slightly. "How are your classes? Are you keeping up with your studies?" "Everything's fine," Emma said, but there was something in her voice that suggested fine was a word that carried a lot of weight. "We just wanted to see you, and we wanted to see the house. Sometimes at school I forget what it looks like." The admission hung in the air like a question mark. Maddie, never one to let adult awkwardness go unaddressed, bounced up from the sofa and thrust the photo album toward Emma. "Look at all these pictures of your family," she said. "There are so many people, and everyone looks really happy. Celeste was telling us about the big dinners they used to have here." Emma accepted the album, and her expression softened as she turned the pages. "I remember some of these. This one was from the last Thanksgiving we had here, right before." She looked up at Celeste. "I was only 9, but I remember the house being full of noise and people everywhere." "I remember the cooking smells," James added, peering over his sister's shoulder. "And Uncle David letting me help carve the turkey, even though I was too little to really help." Celeste sat heavily in one of the library chairs, as if the weight of memory was too much to bear standing. "You were never too little. David always said children should be included in everything, that families worked best when everyone had a job to do." "So why did you stop?" Max asked, with a directness that made adults squirm. "Having the big dinners, I mean." The question created a silence that stretched long enough for Ethan to finish sealing another window section. Finally, Celeste spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to be happy without him. I thought if I changed anything, if I let the house be full of noise and laughter again, it would mean I was forgetting him." Emma closed the photo album and looked directly at her aunt. "We weren't forgetting him at school. We were just forgetting everything else." The simple statement carried the weight of 3 years of careful politeness, of children trying to be what they thought adults needed them to be, instead of what they actually were. Ethan saw Celeste absorb the words like physical blows, saw her recognize the cost of her careful control. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" she asked, and though the invitation was tentative, it was genuine. "All of you, we could order pizza, make it casual." "Pizza in the formal dining room?" Emma asked, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. "Pizza, wherever you want to eat it," Celeste said. "This is your home. It should feel like home." As the afternoon light slanted through the library windows, 6 people began the delicate work of figuring out how to be a family. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be immediate, but for the first time in years, the mansion on the cliff echoed with the sound of children's laughter and the possibility that home was something you created together, not something you preserved in amber. The set of brass keys that unlocked the mansion's guest wing had hung unused on a hook in Janet Morrison's office for nearly 3 years. Each key was meticulously labeled in Janet's careful handwriting: Blue Room, Rose Room, garden suite names that spoke of a time when the Harrington estate had regularly welcomed visitors. When Celeste asked Janet to prepare the guest wing for regular weekend occupancy, the estate manager's surprise was carefully concealed behind professional efficiency, but her pleasure was unmistakable. By November, the weekend arrangement had evolved into something that looked increasingly like family life. Ethan's truck became a familiar sight, winding up the cliff road on Friday afternoons, the bed loaded with overnight bags and whatever projects needed attention around the vast property. Max and Maddie had claimed the Blue Room as their own, delighting in the 4-poster bed that required a small step stool to climb into and the window seat that offered a perfect view of the harbor below. "I think Mrs. Patterson needs her gutters cleaned before the next storm," Ethan said over breakfast on a grey Saturday morning in late November. The formal dining room had given way to the smaller breakfast room, and even that was beginning to feel unnecessarily grand for their growing family gatherings. "Mrs. Patterson from the yellow house by the harbor?" Emma asked, looking up from her French toast. At 12, she had developed an impressive knowledge of village residents and their various maintenance needs. "That's the one. She's 84 and has no business climbing ladders." "We could help," James suggested, earning a sharp look from his sister. "Absolutely not," Celeste said firmly. "Ladder work is not for children." "But we could hold tools," Max pointed out with the logical persistence that made him an effective negotiator, "and hand things up to Dad." Ethan felt the familiar warmth that came whenever the children referred to him as Dad, without qualification. Emma and James had started using the term naturally, without any formal discussion or ceremony, and each time it happened, it felt like a small miracle. "We'll see," he said, which both children correctly interpreted as eventual victory. The conversation was interrupted by Janet's appearance with the morning mail and a slightly puzzled expression. "Mrs. Harrington, you've received an invitation that I think you should see immediately." The envelope was thick cream paper with elegant calligraphy, the kind of invitation that spoke of old money and established traditions. Celeste opened it with the careful movements of someone expecting unwelcome news. "It's from David's brother Michael," she said, scanning the contents. "They're hosting Thanksgiving this year at their place in Bar Harbor. They've invited all of us." The silence that followed carried weight. Emma and James exchanged glances that spoke of conversations they'd had in private, while Max and Maddie waited to see how the adults would navigate this unexpected development. "All of us?" Emma asked carefully. "You, James, myself, and—" Celeste looked at Ethan with uncertainty. "Ethan and the twins, as a family." The word hung in the air between them, carrying implications that none of them had fully examined. They had been living as a family for weeks, but acknowledging it publicly felt like crossing some invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. "That's wonderful," Ethan said, though he felt anything but certain. The idea of meeting David's family, of being evaluated and judged as Celeste's what exactly was he to her, filled him with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Is it wonderful?" Celeste asked, studying his face. "Michael's family can be rather overwhelming, and they'll have questions about our arrangement that I'm not sure how to answer." "What kind of questions?" Maddie asked, with the directness that made adults uncomfortable. "Questions about whether we're friends or something more," Celeste said carefully. The honesty of the response surprised everyone, including Celeste herself. Over the past month, the boundaries between their professional relationship and something deeper had blurred beyond recognition. Ethan found himself looking forward to Friday afternoons with an intensity that had nothing to do with home maintenance, and Celeste had begun consulting him about decisions that went far beyond repair work. "Well, what are we?" James asked, apparently inheriting the family talent for direct questions. It was Max who answered, with the matter-of-fact tone he used for stating obvious truths. "We're a family. We live together on weekends. We eat dinner together. We help each other with problems. That's what families do." "But Dad and Celeste aren't married," Maddie pointed out. "Families usually have married parents." The observation created another silence, this one charged with possibilities that none of the adults had quite dared to voice. Ethan felt the weight of Sarah's ring against his chest and realized that somewhere in the past month, it had stopped feeling like a barrier and started feeling like a blessing, permission to love again, rather than an obligation to remain faithful to the past. "Marriage isn't the only thing that makes a family," Emma said thoughtfully. "At school, some kids have step-parents, some live with grandparents, some have two moms or two dads. What matters is that people choose to take care of each other." "And we do take care of each other," James added. "Celeste helped me with my history project, and Dad taught me how to use a screwdriver properly, and Emma always makes sure Maddie doesn't fall off the garden walls when she's climbing." "I do not need Emma to keep me from falling," Maddie protested, though without much conviction. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sarah McKenna, Millbrook Bay's only physician, and one of the few people who visited the mansion regularly. She appeared in the breakfast room doorway with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been making house calls to check on Celeste's health for years. "Good morning, everyone," she said, then stopped short as she took in the domestic scene before her. "My goodness, Celeste, when Janet said you had company, I didn't realize you meant this much company. Dr. McKenna, let me introduce Ethan Cole and his children, Max and Maddie. They've been helping with some maintenance work around the house." It was a careful introduction that revealed nothing about the true nature of their relationship, but Dr. McKenna was a perceptive woman who had been practicing medicine in small towns long enough to read between the lines. "And these must be Emma and James," she said, greeting the older children with warmth. "You look wonderful, both of you, much happier than the last time I saw you." "We've been spending more time at home," Emma said simply. "I can see that, and it's clearly agreeing with all of you." "Doctor." McKenna's gaze took in the easy interaction between the children, The way Ethan naturally helped clear breakfast dishes, the way Celeste seemed more relaxed than she had in years. "Celeste, you look better than you have since David died. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." After Dr. McKenna left, they returned to the question of Thanksgiving with Michael's family. The invitation lay on the table like a challenge, asking them to define themselves publicly before they had fully understood what they meant to each other privately. "I think we should go," Emma said finally. "I want to see everyone again, and I want them to meet Dad and the twins." The casual way she said, "Dad," when referring to Ethan made everyone pause. It was one thing for the children to use the term in private, another entirely to claim that relationship in front of David's family. "Are you sure?" Celeste asked. "It might be complicated." "Good things usually are," Ethan said, surprising himself with his certainty. "And these children deserve to know their extended family, even if the adults need time to figure out all the details." As they discussed logistics and preparations, Ethan found himself thinking about the keys to the guest wing, how they had unlocked more than just unused rooms. They had opened possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine, creating space for a family that didn't fit any conventional definition but somehow felt more real than anything he had experienced since Sarah's death. Outside the breakfast room windows, November rain drummed against the glass, but inside, 6 people continued the complex work of building something new from the pieces of their separate losses. The legal documents that arrived by courier on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving changed everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Celeste's hands trembled as she read the formal language that transformed what had felt like a gradual awakening into an urgent crisis, and when she looked up at Ethan across the breakfast table, her face had gone pale with something that looked like terror. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup with the careful movements of someone preparing for bad news. "Emma and James's paternal grandparents are filing for custody," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're claiming I'm an unfit guardian because of our arrangement." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Max and Maddie had already left for school, and Emma and James wouldn't arrive from Phillips Academy until Friday afternoon, but their absence felt suddenly ominous rather than temporary. "On what grounds?" Ethan asked, though part of him already understood. A wealthy widow living with a working-class single father, without benefit of marriage, it wouldn't be difficult to construct a scandal from such circumstances, especially if someone was motivated to do so. "Moral turpitude," Celeste read from the legal papers, "creating an unstable environment for minor children. They're arguing that my allowing you and your children to live here part-time represents poor judgment and questionable values." Ethan felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle over him like a blanket. He had known this moment would come eventually, the reckoning where his lack of education, his modest income, his uncertain social standing would be weighed against what Emma and James needed and found wanting. "There's more," Celeste continued, her voice growing steadier as shock gave way to anger. "They're requesting immediate temporary custody pending a formal hearing. They want to remove Emma and James from Phillips Academy and enroll them in a school near their home in Connecticut." "Can they do that?" "With enough lawyers and the right judge, they can do almost anything." She set the papers down with hands that shook slightly. "Emma and James have been with me for 3 years. Their parents will specifically named me as guardian. But if the grandparents can convince a court that I'm providing an immoral environment..." The implications crashed over Ethan like a cold wave. Not only would Emma and James be taken from the only stable home they'd known since their parents' death, but the scrutiny would inevitably extend to his own fitness as a parent. Social services would want to understand why he was living part-time in a mansion with a woman he wasn't married to, what kind of example that set for Max and Maddie. "What do we do?" he asked. Celeste stood and walked to the window that overlooked the village below, her silhouette sharp against the grey November sky. "My lawyer says there are 2 options. We can fight the custody challenge and hope that 3 years of stability outweighs whatever moral objections they raise about our living arrangement. And the other option? We make the moral objection irrelevant. She turned from the window, and Ethan saw something in her eyes that was part desperation and part calculation. "We get married." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. Marriage, the word he hadn't been able to say aloud since Sarah's death, the commitment he'd assumed would never again be part of his vocabulary. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, where Sarah's ring rested against his heart. "Celeste, It would be a marriage of convenience," she said quickly, as if speed could make the proposal less overwhelming. "Legal protection for the children, nothing more. We could maintain separate living arrangements, separate lives. It would just be a piece of paper to satisfy the court." "A piece of paper," he repeated, testing the words. "You don't have to answer now, but the hearing is scheduled for December 15th. If we're going to do this, we need to do it soon." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and legal consultations. Celeste's attorney, Harrison Blake, was a polished Boston lawyer who spoke in careful phrases designed to minimize liability while maximizing billable hours. He laid out the case with clinical precision. Emma and James's grandparents had significant financial resources and influential connections. They were arguing that Celeste's judgment had been compromised by grief and loneliness, that she was making decisions based on emotional need rather than what was best for the children. The living arrangement with Mr. Cole certainly provides them with ammunition, Blake said, consulting his notes with the detached air of someone discussing a particularly complex tax issue. "A single man, no college education, modest income. The optics are challenging." Ethan sat in Blake's mahogany-paneled office, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. Every choice he'd made since Sarah's death was being dissected and found wanting his decision to stay in Millbrook Bay rather than seeking better opportunities in Portland or Boston. His focus on providing stability for his children rather than pursuing financial advancement. His growing feelings for a woman whose wealth made their relationship appear suspect. However, Blake continued, a marriage would substantially strengthen Mrs. Harrington's position. It would demonstrate commitment and stability, provide the children with a two-parent household, and eliminate any suggestion of impropriety. "What about Mr. Cole's children?" Celeste asked. "Would this arrangement provide them with any additional security?" "Adoption would be possible once the marriage is established and the custody situation is resolved. Mr. Cole would have access to resources that could significantly improve his children's educational and financial prospects." The lawyer's words painted a picture of a transaction rather than a relationship, a merger of practical interests rather than a union of hearts. But Ethan found himself thinking about Max and Maddie, about the opportunities that Celeste's resources could provide, about the security that had always felt just out of reach. That evening, they walked along the cliff path that bordered Celeste's property, the November wind carrying the salt smell of winter storms building far out at sea. Neither of them spoke for a long time, both lost in thoughts too complex for easy conversation. "I've been thinking about what Blake said," Celeste finally broke the silence, "about this being a marriage of convenience." "It makes sense," Ethan said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "The children need protection, and I need to be practical about their futures." "Is that what you want? To be practical?" The question stopped him in his tracks. Below them, the lights of Millbrook Bay twinkled like fallen stars, and above them, the mansion rose against the darkening sky like something from a fairy tale. In the space between village and castle, between practical necessity and impossible dreams, Ethan felt the weight of choices that would reshape all their lives. "I want Emma and James to be safe," he said finally. "I want Max and Maddie to have opportunities I can't give them on my own. I want you to have the family you've been too afraid to reach for. And what do you want for yourself?" It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one that required him to look beyond duty and sacrifice to the desires he'd buried with Sarah. When he answered, his voice was barely audible above the wind. "I want to love again without feeling guilty about it. I want to wake up in the morning excited about the day ahead instead of just trying to get through it. I want to be part of something bigger than my own small worries." Celeste stopped walking and turned to face him, her hair whipping around her face in the ocean breeze. Those don't sound like the wants of someone entering a marriage of convenience. No, he admitted, they don't. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that held possibilities too fragile to examine too closely. I bought this today, after we left Blake's office. I told myself it was just a prop, something to make the marriage look legitimate to the court. Inside the box lay a simple gold band, elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of ring that spoke of commitment rather than display. Ethan stared at it, thinking of the chain around his neck and the promise it represented. "I can't promise you love," Celeste said quietly. "I'm not sure I remember how to love someone without losing myself in the process. But I can promise you partnership and respect and the chance to build something good for all our children." Ethan took the ring from its box, feeling the weight of it against his palm. It was heavier than Sarah's had been, more substantial, as if it understood the complexity of the commitment it represented. "The children should have a say in this," he said. "All 4 of them. This affects their lives as much as ours." "Agreed. We'll tell them together when Emma and James come home for Thanksgiving." As they walked back toward the mansion, Ethan felt the future shifting around them like tide pools, reshaping themselves with each wave. In 3 weeks, they would stand before a judge and argue for the right to remain a family. The form that family took was still being negotiated, but for the first time since the legal papers had arrived, he felt something that might have been hope. Sarah's letter was folded so many times that the creases had worn soft as silk. Hidden in the back of her jewelry box beneath earrings she'd never had occasion to wear and a string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. Ethan found it on the Sunday after Thanksgiving, while searching for Sarah's wedding ring to return it to its proper place among her other treasures. The envelope bore his name in her careful handwriting, along with a note that made his hands shake. "To be opened when you're ready to love again." He sat on the edge of their bed's bed, now holding the letter like something that might explode. Outside, Max and Maddie were playing in the backyard with Emma and James, their laughter carrying through windows that Sarah had insisted on keeping open even in November because she loved the sound of children being children. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given the conversation that awaited them all. Thanksgiving at Michael Harrington's sprawling Bar Harbor estate had been both easier and more difficult than expected. David's family had welcomed Ethan and the twins with genuine warmth, though their curiosity about his relationship with Celeste had been barely concealed. The children had thrived in the company of cousins they barely remembered, and for a few hours it had been possible to imagine that their blended family might actually work. Then Michael had pulled Celeste aside for a private conversation that lasted 40 minutes and left her pale and shaken. The custody challenge wasn't just about Emma and James's grandparents wanting control, it was about money, significant money. Trust funds and inheritance issues that made the children valuable assets, as well as beloved family members. The Weatherbys have always resented that David left everything to me, instead of setting up separate trusts for the children. Celeste had explained during the drive home. If they can prove I'm an unfit guardian, they become the trustees of Emma and James's inheritance until they reach 25. "How much money are we talking about?" Ethan had asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "Enough to make this worth fighting very dirty for." Now, 3 days later, the custody hearing loomed just 2 weeks away, and they still hadn't told the children about the marriage proposal. Every conversation seemed to lead toward the topic, then veer away at the last moment, as if they were all afraid of what honesty might require. Ethan opened Sarah's letter with fingers that trembled slightly. "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you found someone who makes you want to take off your wedding ring and put it away with the rest of my things. I hope that's exactly what's happening, because the thought of you spending the rest of your life married to my memory makes me sadder than anything about dying. I know you think loving someone else would be a betrayal of what we had, but you're wrong. The best proof of how much our marriage meant would be your willingness to risk that kind of love again. I want Max and Maddie to see you happy, really happy, not just content. I want them to understand that love isn't something you ration, but something that grows when you're brave enough to plant new seeds. Don't marry someone just because it's practical, but don't avoid marrying someone just because it scares you. You have so much love to give, my darling man. Find someone worthy of it, and let yourself be worthy of theirs. All my love, always and forever, Sarah. P.S. The children will be fine. They're stronger and more adaptable than you think. Trust them to handle the truth, and trust yourself to handle their questions. Ethan read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Sarah had known this day would commeno the specific circumstances, but the essential choice between safety and risk, between honoring the past and embracing the future. Her blessing felt like a physical weight lifting from his shoulders, permission to want things he'd been afraid to acknowledge. Downstairs, Celeste was in the kitchen with Janet, planning the week's logistics with the careful attention to detail that wealth required. Private tutors would come to the house while Emma and James were suspended from Philip's Academy pending the custody hearing. A child psychologist would conduct interviews to assess the children's emotional well-being. Lawyers would review every aspect of their living arrangement, looking for weaknesses that opposing counsel might exploit. The investigator will want to examine your cottage as well, Celeste said when Ethan joined them. Harrison thinks it's important that they see how the children live in both environments. The thought of strangers picking through his modest home, cataloguing its shortcomings, and comparing them to the mansion's grandeur made Ethan's stomach clench. But if that's what it took to keep their family together, he would endure the scrutiny. "There's something else," Janet said, consulting her ever-present notebook. "The Weatherbys have hired a private investigator. He's been asking questions in the village about Mr. Cole's financial situation, his parenting, his relationship with Mrs. Harrington." "What kind of questions?" Ethan asked. "Whether you've been living here full-time, whether the children have been unsupervised, whether there's been any evidence of inappropriate behavior." Janet's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide her distaste for the entire business. Mrs. Patterson told him it was none of his damn business and slammed the door in his face. Despite everything, Ethan smiled at the image of 84-year-old Mrs. Patterson defending his honor to a private investigator. Millbrook Bay might be a small community, but it protected its own. "We need to tell the children," Celeste said abruptly, "about the custody challenge, about the marriage proposal, about all of it. They're going to hear rumors, and they deserve to know the truth from us." "Tonight?" "Tonight." The conversation took place in the mansion's library, where dusty photo albums had first revealed the possibility of family happiness. All 4 children sat on the Persian rug in front of the fireplace, their faces serious as they sensed the weight of what was coming. Ethan began with the facts. Emma and James's grandparents wanted custody. The court hearing scheduled for mid-December, the legal challenges they were facing. The children listened with the focused attention of people much older than their years, asking clarifying questions that revealed they understood far more about adult complexity than he'd given them credit for. "So they want to take us away because you and Dad aren't married?" Emma asked, her voice steady but her hands clenched in her lap. "That's part of their argument," Celeste said carefully. "They think our living arrangement isn't appropriate for children." "But we're happy here," James protested. "We're doing better in school. We have friends in the village. We have a real family for the first time since Mom and Dad died." "I know, sweetheart, but sometimes what makes us happy isn't what other adults think is best for us." Max had been quiet throughout the explanation, but now he spoke with the deliberate precision that meant he'd been thinking hard about the problem. "If you got married, would that solve it?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised. Ethan Max had always cut straight to the heart of complicated issues, but it still left him momentarily speechless. "It would help," Celeste said, "but marriage isn't something people should do just to solve legal problems." "Unless they want to get married anyway," Maddie said with 8-year-old logic. "Do you want to get married anyway?" It was Emma who answered, her 12-year-old wisdom cutting through adult equivocation. "They're scared to want it because they think it would be wrong somehow." Dad feels guilty about loving someone besides our mum, and Celeste feels guilty about loving someone besides Uncle David. The accuracy of her assessment left both adults staring. When had Emma learned to read emotions with such precision? When had all four children become so adept at navigating the complex geography of adult hearts? But here's the thing, James added, leaning forward with the earnestness that made him such an effective peacemaker among his siblings. Mom and Uncle David are dead. They can't get married to anyone else, and they can't take care of us anymore. But you're alive, and we need you to take care of us, and maybe you need us to take care of you too. You do take care of us, Max said firmly. Both of you, and we want to stay together, so if getting married keeps us together, then you should get married. It's not that simple, Ethan began, but Maddie interrupted with the exasperated tone she used when adults were being unnecessarily complicated. Why isn't it that simple? You love each other, right? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan looked at Celeste across the space between them, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They had been so careful not to examine their feelings too closely, so focused on practical arrangements and legal necessities that they had avoided the fundamental question. Yes, Celeste said quietly. I think we do. Then that's settled, Emma said with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully solved a difficult problem. You'll get married, we'll stay together, and the grandparents can find something else to worry about. As the children dispersed to their various bedrooms, Ethan and Celeste remained in the library, surrounded by the ghosts of previous conversations and the weight of decisions that would reshape all their lives. Sarah wrote me a letter, Ethan said, pulling the worn pages from his pocket. She said I should trust the children to handle the truth and trust myself to handle their questions. Celeste read the letter in silence, then folded it carefully and handed it back. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, and she would have liked you. How can you be sure? Ethan smiled, thinking of Sarah's uncanny ability to see straight to the heart of people, her talent for recognizing kindness beneath protective armor. Because she always said the best way to honor love was to be brave enough to love again. Outside the library windows, December stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles but somehow reassuring in their constancy. In 2 weeks, they would stand before a judge and argue for the right to remain a family. But tonight, in a room warmed by firelight and filled with the echo of children's laughter, that family felt strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. The handwritten letters from all 4 children lay on Judge Patricia Morrison's desk like evidence of something too precious to be decided by legal precedent alone. Emma's careful cursive filled 3 pages with detailed explanations of why she and James belonged with Celeste and Ethan. James's shorter but equally heartfelt note spoke of feeling safe for the first time since his parents' death. Max had written about having older siblings who taught him new games and helped with homework. Maddie's letter, decorated with crayon drawings of their blended family, declared that everyone should live where they get the most hugs. The Cumberland County Courthouse in Portland felt like a cathedral of judgment, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of people whose lives hung in the balance of other people's decisions. Ethan sat in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table, wearing the only suit he owned purchased for Sarah's funeral and worn only for the most solemn occasion since. Beside him, Max and Maddie fidgeted in their best clothes, their usual chatter subdued by the gravity of the proceedings. Charles and Margaret Weatherby commanded attention even in silence. He was a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from a lifetime of boardroom authority. She wore pearls and a navy suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage payment. They had flown up from Connecticut with a legal team that filled 3 rows of the courthouse gallery, their resources on full display. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison, the bailiff announced, and the courtroom shuffled to its feet with the rustling of expensive fabric and nervous anticipation. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for legal grandstanding, qualities that Harrison Blake had assured them would work in their favor. This is a hearing to determine the best interests of Emma Catherine Harrington and James David Harrington, currently in the custody of their aunt, Celeste Marie Harrington. Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. The petitioners, Charles and Margaret Weatherby, are seeking to modify the existing custody arrangement on grounds that the current guardian is providing an unsuitable environment for the minor children. The Weatherby's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Sterling, rose to present their case with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. She painted a picture of Celeste as a woman whose judgment had been compromised by grief and loneliness, who had made impulsive decisions about the children's welfare without proper consideration of their long-term needs. Mrs. Harrington has allowed an unmarried man and his children to essentially move into her home, Sterling argued, her voice carrying just the right note of moral concern. Mr. Cole, while undoubtedly well-meaning, lacks the educational background and financial resources to provide guidance for children who will inherit substantial wealth. The arrangement creates confusion about family structure and appropriate boundaries. Ethan felt each criticism like a physical blow. His lack of college education, his modest income, his uncertain legal relationship with Celestial of it was laid out for judicial examination like evidence of moral failure. He watched the judge's face for reaction, but found only professional neutrality. Furthermore, Sterling continued, the children have been removed from their established educational environment and social connections without adequate consultation. Phillips Academy provided stability and excellence that cannot be replicated in rural Maine, regardless of how picturesque the setting might be. When it was Harrison Blake's turn to respond, he chose a different strategy. Instead of defending against the specific accusations, he focused on results, the children's improved academic performance since spending more time at home, their emotional stability, their expressed wishes about where they wanted to live. Your Honor, this case isn't about conventional family structures or financial resources, Blake said, his voice carrying the measured authority of decades of courtroom experience. It's about what serves the best interests of two children who have already suffered tremendous loss. The evidence will show that Emma and James Harrington are thriving in their current environment, that they have formed meaningful bonds with all members of their household, and that their emotional and educational needs are being met more effectively than at any time since their parents' death. The morning was consumed by testimony from expert witnesses, child psychologists who had interviewed the children, educators who spoke about their academic progress, social workers who had evaluated the living arrangements. Each expert painted a different picture, but gradually a pattern emerged of children who were healing from trauma and rebuilding their ability to trust. Dr. Sarah McKenna took the stand as a character witness for Celeste, her testimony carrying the weight of someone who had observed the family's dynamics firsthand. I've been Mrs. Harrington's physician for 8 years, she said, and I've never seen her as emotionally healthy as she's been these past few months. She's engaged with life again, making plans for the future, investing in relationships. The children aren't just living in her house, they're bringing her back to life. The most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Patterson, despite her 84 years and arthritic hands, had insisted on attending the hearing to speak about Ethan's character. That boy has been fixing things in our village for 10 years, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite her age. He's never overcharged, never done shoddy work, never failed to show up when someone needed help. More importantly, he's raised those twins of his to be polite, responsible children who know right from wrong. If you want to know what kind of father he is, look at how his children treat other people. Village teacher Mrs. Chen testified about Max and Maddie's academic progress and social development, while Principal Rodriguez spoke about the positive influence of having older siblings in their lives. But it was the letters that seemed to carry the most weight. Judge Morrison read each one carefully, her expression softening as she absorbed the children's own words about their lives and their wishes. These letters will be entered as evidence, she said, looking directly at the 4 children seated in the front row. The court recognizes that while children's preferences aren't determinative, they carry significant weight when the children are old enough to understand the implications of their choices. As the morning session concluded, Ethan felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a physical force. The Weatherbys had presented a compelling case for traditional stability and conventional family structure. Whether love and commitment could outweigh legal precedent and social expectations remained to be seen. The wedding rings that Ethan and Celeste exchanged in the courthouse hallway during the lunch recess were simple gold bands purchased that morning from a jewelry store 3 blocks away. There had been no time for ceremony, no opportunity for the kind of careful planning that weddings usually required. Judge Morrison had made her ruling clear. She would grant custody to Celeste, but only if the family structure provided the stability that traditional marriage represented. The court finds that the current living arrangement, while unconventional, has demonstrably benefited all 4 children involved. Judge Morrison had said, her voice carrying the weight of Solomon's wisdom. However, the legal and social uncertainties inherent in an unmarried cohabitation arrangement do not serve the children's long-term interests. If Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Cole are willing to formalize their commitment through marriage, this court will deny the petition for custody modification. The 30-minute recess had become a whirlwind of phone calls and hurried preparations. Harrison Blake had located a judge willing to perform an emergency ceremony, while Janet Morisono, relation to the presiding judge, despite the shared Sonam, had driven down from Millbrook Bay with the children's best clothes and a small bouquet of winter roses from Celeste's greenhouse. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked as they stood in the narrow hallway outside family court, surrounded by the controlled chaos of their impromptu wedding party. Max and Maddie flanked him like small sentinels, while Emma and James stood beside Celeste with expressions that mixed excitement and uncertainty. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Celeste replied, and the conviction in her voice surprised them both. "Not because a judge is requiring it, but because these children need us to be brave enough to choose each other completely." The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes, conducted by Judge William Cross in his chambers, with all 4 children serving as witnesses. There were no flowers except Janet's roses, no music except the muffled sounds of the courthouse around them, no guests except the small family they had fought so hard to protect. "Do you, Ethan James Cole, take Celeste Marie Harrington to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" The words carried weight beyond their legal function. Ethan looked into Celeste's eyes and saw not the desperate expedient that had brought them to this moment, but the woman who had learned to trust again, who had opened her carefully guarded heart to the possibility of messiness and joy and the beautiful complications that came with loving children. "I do," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Do you, Celeste Marie Harrington, take Ethan James Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Celeste's answer came without hesitation. "I do." The ring slipped onto their fingers with surprising ease, as if they had been designed for this moment, rather than purchased in desperation an hour earlier. When Judge Cross pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle, tentative, but real, the first authentic moment of intimacy in a day consumed by legal necessity. "Congratulations," Emma said when they broke apart, her 12-year-old composure cracking to reveal genuine happiness. "Now we're really a family." They returned to family court as Mr. and Mrs. Cole, the marriage certificate still warm from the printer in Judge Cross's chambers. The afternoon session proceeded with the measured pace of legal formality, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Judge Morrison reviewed the new circumstances with obvious approval, noting that the children's best interests were now clearly aligned with legal and social conventions. "This court finds that the petitioner's concerns about family stability have been addressed through the respondent's marriage," she said, her gavel poised to make their victory official. "The petition for custody modification is hereby denied." Emma Catherine Harrington and James David Harrington shall remain in the custody of their aunt, now Mrs. Celeste Cole, with Mr. Ethan Cole serving as their stepfather and legal guardian. The Weatherbys received the decision with the grace of people accustomed to occasional defeats in the larger game of wealth and influence. Charles Weatherby shook Ethan's hand with grudging respect, while Margaret hugged Celeste with what appeared to be genuine affection. "We only wanted what was best for the children," she said quietly. "I hope you understand that." "I do understand," Celeste replied, "and I hope you'll be part of their lives going forward. They need as much family as they can get." As they left the courthouse, 6 people who had entered as a fragile alliance emerged as something stronger and more durable. The December air was crisp with the promise of snow, and Millbrook Bay waited for them at the end of a winding road that led home. "So what happens now?" James asked, as they walked toward the parking garage, where 2 vehicles waited: Ethan's battered pickup truck and Celeste's elegant sedan. "Now we go home," Ethan said, testing the weight of the pronoun that encompassed all of them. "Now we figure out how to be married and be parents and be a family all at the same time." "That sounds complicated," Max observed. "The best things usually are," Celeste said, taking her new husband's hand as they walked toward their future together. The new family portrait that graced the mansion's main hallway 6 months later told the story of transformation in a single frame. 6 people arranged on the front steps of the Gothic Revival house, the late spring light casting everything in gold, Ethan and Celeste in the center, with matching wedding rings catching the sun. The 4 children arrayed around them with genuine smiles that spoke of security and belonging. Where once solitary photographs of David had dominated the hall, now this image of chosen family took pride of place, a daily reminder that love could take many forms and still be authentic. The changes that marriage had brought to their daily lives were both profound and surprisingly natural. Ethan's cottage in the village had been converted to a rental property that provided modest additional income, while his tools and workshop had found permanent homes in the mansion's restored carriage house. The formal dining room now hosted homework sessions and art projects, alongside elegant dinner parties, its mahogany table bearing the honorable scars of family life. "Dad, can you help me with this math problem?" Emma called from the kitchen table where she was working on summer assignments, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who had never doubted her place in the family hierarchy. Ethan looked up from the window frame. He was repairing maintenance work that had become a labor of love rather than professional obligation. "Which one's giving you trouble?" "Algebra. James says it's easy, but I think he's showing off." "I am not showing off." James protested from his position on the floor, where he was building an elaborate city from wooden blocks with Max and Maddie. "Algebra actually is logical once you understand the basic principles." "Nobody likes a know-it-all," Maddie informed him with 10-year-old authority, though her tone held more affection than criticism. These were the sounds that filled the mansion: no-sibling arguments and collaborative projects, homework struggles and creative chaos. The house that had echoed with silence for nearly a decade hummed with the constant activity of 4 children who treated it as a playground as much as a home. Celeste emerged from David's former officino, transformed into the family command center, where she managed both household logistics and her growing involvement in local community projects. The careful preservation of the past had given way to practical adaptation for the present, though David's portrait still held a place of honor above the fireplace, and his memory remained woven into the fabric of their daily lives. "The summer schedule is complete," she announced, consulting the detailed calendar that had become essential for coordinating 4 children's activities. Swimming lessons for everyone, sailing camp for Emma and James, art classes for Maddie, and that robotics program Max has been asking about. The transformation in Celeste herself was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. The withdrawn widow, who had once hidden behind formal politeness, now threw herself into family life with an enthusiasm that delighted everyone around her. She had learned to braid hair and mediate disputes, to pack school lunches and attend soccer games, to balance checkbooks and bandage scraped knees with equal competence. "Don't forget we're having dinner with Michael and Sarah next weekend," Ethan said, using the familiar names that had replaced the formal titles of early acquaintance. David's brother and sister-in-law had become genuine friends, their initial skepticism about the hasty marriage giving way to appreciation for the happiness it had brought to everyone involved. "And Mrs. Patterson is coming for lunch on Sunday," Emma added. "She wants to see James's model airplane collection." The easy integration of village life into mansion society had surprised everyone. Celeste's wealth no longer seemed like a barrier between their family and the community below. Instead, it had become a resource that benefited everyone. The Millbrook Bay Community Center now had a new heating system. The elementary school boasted updated computer equipment, and several village families had found employment maintaining the mansion's extensive grounds. "Mom, can we have pancakes for dinner?" Max asked, using the title that had evolved naturally over the months of shared daily life. Celeste paused in her schedule review, struck as she still sometimes was by the simple magic of being called Mom by children who meant it. "Pancakes for dinner sounds perfect," she said, "but only if everyone helps clean up afterward." As evening approached, the family gathered in the kitchen for their unconventional dinner, the informal meal a deliberate choice that reflected their rejection of unnecessary formality. Conversation flowed easily between school achievements and summer plans, between village gossip and mansion maintenance, between the ordinary concerns that made up the texture of family life. After dinner, they migrated to the library for their evening ritual story time for the younger children, reading time for the older ones, and the quiet companionship that had become Ethan and Celeste's favorite part of each day. The room where they had first shared coffee during a storm now served as the heart of their home, filled with the comfortable sounds of a family settling into evening routine. "Remember when we thought getting married was going to be complicated?" Celeste said quietly, settling beside Ethan on the sofa where they could supervise homework and monitor bedtime preparations. "Everything's complicated," Ethan replied, watching Max help Maddie with a puzzle, while Emma read aloud to James from a book about knights and dragons. "The good things just make the complications worthwhile." Outside the library windows, Millbrook Bay twinkled in the gathering dusk, the lights of the village reflecting on water that had witnessed countless storms and countless recoveries. Inside the mansion that had once been a shrine to the past, 6 people continued the daily work of building a future together. When bedtime arrived, Ethan found himself repeating the prayer that had opened their story. The words Sarah had taught him now shared with 4 children instead of 2. But the blessing had evolved, grown to encompass the larger love that filled their lives. "Thank you for our family," he whispered into the darkness after the children had settled into sleep. "Thank you for second chances and brave hearts, and the wisdom to recognize love when it arrives wearing work clothes." Beside him, Celeste murmured her own gratitude for the storm that had brought them together, for the courage to open long-closed doors, for the discovery that the greatest repairs happened not to roofs and walls, but to hearts that had forgotten how to hope. In the mansion on the cliff above Millbrook Bay, a handyman and a widow had built something more valuable than either, had dared to imagine a family forged not by blood or law, but by the simple choice to love completely and without reservation. And that, they had learned, was the strongest foundation of all.